Imagine Chuck Norris, not silhouetted against a dusty sunset after vanquishing villains, but standing under the fluorescent glare of a badly lit community center multipurpose room, facing an adversary far more insidious and bewildering than any movie bad guy, the Homeowners Association Board of Directors. You clicked expecting maybe a tongue-in-cheek story, a humorous take on Norris dealing with petty neighborhood rules, perhaps Roundhouse kicking a citation for lawn height. The common belief is that HOAs, with their labyrinthine bylaws, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and armies of pedantic board members armed with violation notices, are an unmovable, unassailable force of suburban beige tyranny. Fighting them is seen as tilting at windmills, a frustrating exercise in futility destined to end in fines, liens, and bitter resignation. We've all heard the horror stories, the tales of neighbors driven to madness over the precise shade of their mailbox or the placement of a garden gnome. But this wasn't just about mailbox colors or overgrown hedges. This was about something vital, something vibrant being deliberately extinguished by bureaucratic apathy and misplaced priorities. This was about the heart of the neighborhood, a beloved, slightly worn playground teeming with the laughter and energy of children, suddenly targeted for demolition to make way for something sterile and exclusive. Private tennis courts favored by the very board members wielding the power to destroy it. Therefore, Chuck Norris, a resident who valued community spirit and the simple joy of kids playing freely far more than exclusive amenities, found himself drawn into a conflict he never sought, becoming the reluctant but unwavering champion for the neighborhood's families against the entrenched power of the HOA board. We're going to witness how this quiet resident, known globally for decisive action, deployed patience, strategy, community organizing, and sheer relentless determination to challenge the HOA's decree, navigate the treacherous waters of bylaws and board meetings, rally a fractured neighborhood, and fight tooth and nail to save a simple patch of mulch and metal that represented so much more than just a place to slide and swing. Proving that sometimes the toughest battles are fought not with fists, but with petitions, proxies, and unwavering principle right in your own backyard. We'll delve into the arrogance of the HOA board, the initial despair of the families, Norris's unexpected emergence as their leader, the intricate tactics used to counter the board's maneuvers, and the dramatic showdown that determined the fate of the children's cherished sanctuary. The community, known as Oak Ridge Estates, was a sprawling development typical of many American suburbs: pleasant houses, manicured lawns, curving streets named after trees, and a central common area featuring amenities managed, or rather, ruled, by the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. For over 15 years, the heart of this common area was the Adventure Playground, a slightly faded but sturdy collection of swings, slides, climbing structures, and sandboxes nestled under the shade of mature oak trees planted by the original developers. It wasn't state-of-the-art. The paint was peeling in places, the mulch needed replenishing more often than the HOA budget seemed to allow, but it was deeply loved. It was the place where toddlers took their first tentative steps on grass, where older kids organized elaborate games of tag, where parents gathered on worn wooden benches, forging friendships while keeping a watchful eye. It was the social hub, the memory maker, the one truly inclusive space accessible to every child in the neighborhood, regardless of their parents' social standing or athletic inclinations. Chuck Norris, who owned a modest home in a quieter section of Oak Ridge, often enjoyed walking his dog along the paths bordering the common area. He appreciated the sound of children's laughter drifting from the playground, a sound he considered the lifeblood of any healthy community. He wasn't actively involved in HOA politics, preferring a quiet life, but he observed the neighborhood dynamics with a keen eye. He saw the playground's constant use, the spontaneous community it fostered. Therefore, he was more than a little surprised when a stark white notice appeared one Monday morning, tacked crudely onto the playground's main signpost and duplicated on community bulletin boards. The notice, printed in cold, bureaucratic font, announced the HOA board's unanimous decision, made during a closed executive session, to permanently remove the adventure playground within 60 days. The stated reason was underutilization and excessive maintenance costs, coupled with plans to enhance community value by constructing 2 new, state-of-the-art tennis courts and a pickleball court on the site, funded by a special assessment levied on all homeowners. There was no mention of community consultation, no survey results cited, just a blunt decree from the 5-member board. The reaction among neighborhood families was immediate and visceral. It started with bewildered text messages flying between parents. "Did you see the sign? They can't be serious. Where are the kids supposed to play?" Disbelief quickly morphed into anger and a sense of profound betrayal. Parents like Lisa Diaz, a mother of 3 young children who practically lived at the playground after school, felt blindsided. "Underutilized? We're here every single day. It's packed," she exclaimed to her neighbor, Mark Chin, whose twin daughters were heartbroken at the news. Mark, usually mild-mannered, felt a surge of indignation. "Excessive maintenance? They barely spend anything on it. A load of mulch twice a year doesn't break the bank. This is about those tennis courts." It quickly became clear that the tennis courts were the pet project of the HOA president, a pompous, self-important retired executive named Bernard Finley, and his close ally on the board, Brenda Carmichael, both avid tennis players who lamented the lack of proper facilities in Oak Ridge. They viewed the playground as noisy, messy, and aesthetically unpleasing compared to the imagined elegance of neatly lined courts. The other 3 board members, generally passive and easily swayed by Finley's bluster, had apparently rubber-stamped the decision without much thought or any attempt to gauge community sentiment. An emergency, informal gathering of concerned parents convened near the playground that very evening. The mood was a mixture of outrage, frustration, and helplessness. They talked about petitions, about writing letters, about pleading with the board at the next meeting. But there was an underlying current of pessimism. Finley and his faction were known for their autocratic style, their dismissal of dissenting opinions, their mastery of parliamentary procedure to shut down opposition during meetings. They had the bylaws, the HOA's lawyer on retainer, the perceived authority. Therefore, many felt resigned, believing the fight was already lost, the playground doomed. They had seen Finley railroad unpopular decisions before, using procedural roadblocks and sheer force of personality. They lacked organization, resources, and crucially, a leader who could effectively challenge the board's entrenched power. The energy began to dissipate into frustrated sighs and head-shaking despair. Chuck Norris hadn't attended the impromptu gathering, preferring initially to observe and gather information quietly. He had read the notice, felt the same surge of disbelief and indignation as his neighbors. He saw the playground not as an amenity to be assessed for value enhancement, but as a vital part of the community's social fabric, essential for the well-being of its youngest residents. He found the board's justification flimsy and insulting, the process utterly lacking in transparency. The idea of replacing a free, inclusive space for children with exclusive courts primarily benefiting a small, affluent clique felt fundamentally unjust. He listened to the frustrated conversations echoing through the neighborhood over the next few days, heard the sense of powerlessness from parents, like Lisa and Mark. He saw the petition sheets circulating, gathering signatures but lacking a clear strategy beyond simply expressing discontent. He knew that petitions alone would likely be ignored by Finley's board. They needed leverage, organization, and a willingness to fight smarter, not just louder. Therefore, Norris decided it was time to step out of the shadows. He wasn't seeking a leadership role, but he couldn't stand by and watch the community's heart be ripped out without a proper fight. He approached Mark Chin first, finding him glumly watching his daughters on the swings. "Mark," Norris began quietly, "I've been hearing the talk about the playground. It seems like a raw deal for the kids." Mark sighed. "It is, Mr. Norris. But I don't know what we can do. Finley runs that board like his personal kingdom." Norris nodded slowly. "Maybe. But kingdoms can be challenged. What if we got organized? Really organized. Looked at the bylaws, understood the procedures, built a coalition." He wasn't making grand promises, just planting a seed of possibility. He then spoke with Lisa Diaz, with other concerned parents, even with some older residents without young children who simply felt the board's decision was high-handed and wrong. He didn't position himself as a celebrity savior. He spoke as a fellow resident, a neighbor concerned about the process and the outcome. His quiet confidence, his calm demeanor, and perhaps the subtle weight of his known persona, began to cut through the despair. People started listening, hope flickering tentatively. He suggested a formal meeting, not at the playground, but in someone's spacious garage, away from the board's immediate orbit, to discuss strategy. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of residents packed into the Chen family's garage the following Saturday morning, a standing room-only crowd buzzing with nervous energy and newfound purpose. Norris, standing not on a stage but simply among his neighbors, facilitated the discussion. The first step, Norris emphasized, was understanding the enemy and the battlefield. This wasn't a street fight, it was a procedural war. Therefore, he proposed they meticulously dissect the Oak Ridge Estates HOA bylaws, CC and RS, and any relevant state statutes governing homeowners associations. Several residents volunteered, a paralegal named Susan Miller, a retired accountant named George Pappas, even a tech-savvy teenager named Kevin who offered to digitize and search the often dense documents. Norris himself spent hours poring over the thick binder of rules, highlighting sections related to common area modifications, special assessments, board authority, meeting procedures, and member voting rights. What they discovered was both discouraging and potentially empowering. The bylaws granted the board significant authority over common areas but required specific procedures for capital improvements exceeding a certain threshold, including potential notification requirements, and, crucially, member input mechanisms that Finley's board seemed to have ignored by making the decision in a closed executive session, potentially violating their own rules and state open meeting guidelines for HOAs. They also found clauses detailing how members could challenge board decisions, call special meetings, and even initiate recall proceedings against board members, though the signature thresholds were high and the processes deliberately cumbersome. Armed with this knowledge, the group, now calling itself Friends of Adventure Playground, devised a multi-pronged strategy under Norris's quiet guidance. Phase 1: Formal Challenge and Delay. Susan Miller drafted a detailed letter to the board, co-signed by dozens of residents, formally objecting to the playground removal, citing the potential procedural violations regarding the executive session decision and the lack of required member consultation for a major capital improvement project involving a special assessment. The letter demanded the board provide minutes from the executive session justifying the decision, knowing they likely wouldn't or couldn't adequately document it, proof of the alleged underutilization and excessive maintenance costs, and details on the bidding process for the tennis court construction. They also formally requested the decision be tabled pending a full community meeting and survey. This wasn't just a plea, it was a legalistic challenge designed to force the board onto the defensive and potentially expose their procedural missteps. Phase 2: Mobilization and Public Pressure. While awaiting the board's response, the group launched a coordinated campaign to galvanize neighborhood support. Kevin built a simple website and social media page sharing updates, testimonials from families about the playground's importance, and easy-to-share information countering the board's claims. Volunteers went door-to-door with flyers, explaining the situation and urging neighbors to attend the upcoming HOA monthly meeting en masse. They focused not just on families with young children, but on appealing to everyone's sense of fairness, community spirit, and fiscal responsibility regarding the special assessment for courts many wouldn't use. They organized visible, positive events at the playground, family picnic days, cleanup efforts, demonstrating community care, subtly countering the excessive maintenance claim, generating local media interest. Norris, while preferring to stay out of the direct spotlight initially, used his contacts discreetly to ensure a local news reporter specializing in community issues became aware of the brewing conflict. The HOA board, particularly President Finley, reacted predictably, with arrogance and dismissal. They sent a terse, dismissive response to Susan Miller's letter, drafted by the HOA's lawyer, essentially stating the board acted within its authority, the executive session was justified under exceptions for contractual matters, a flimsy pretext, and the decision was final. They refused to provide detailed cost breakdowns or utilization data, labeling the requests harassing and obstructionist. Finley, during phone calls with complaining residents, was reportedly condescending, telling one mother that perhaps her children could take up tennis, and advising another resident concerned about the assessment to better manage their finances. This arrogance, however, proved to be a tactical error. It galvanized the opposition, fueling their determination. Therefore, the Friends of Adventure Playground escalated their efforts. They knew the upcoming monthly HOA meeting would be crucial. Finley typically controlled these meetings tightly, limiting speaking time, ruling motions out of order, and using the agenda to bury contentious items. Norris, understanding procedural tactics, coached the residents on how to effectively participate. They assigned specific speakers to address different points concisely. Lisa Diaz spoke emotionally about the playground's importance to families. George Pappas presented a clear analysis questioning the financial justification and the burden of the special assessment. Susan Miller calmly outlined the procedural violations and the potential legal liability for the board. Crucially, they mobilized turnout. On the night of the meeting, the community center room was overflowing. Residents stood along the walls, spilled out into a hallway, their presence a silent rebuke to the board's claim of acting for the community. Finley, visibly irritated by the massive crowd, attempted to rush through the agenda, but the prepared residents were persistent. When Finley tried to cut off Lisa Diaz, citing the 3-minute speaking limit, dozens of residents politely but firmly called out, "Let her speak!" The board's usual intimidation tactics weren't working against this organized, informed, and unified crowd. Norris sat quietly in the back, observing, his presence alone seemingly bolstering the residents' courage. When George Pappas demanded detailed financials on the tennis court bids and the playground maintenance, Finley stammered, claiming the information was confidential. Due to ongoing negotiations, a response met with audible scoffs. Susan Miller then formally moved to rescind the board's prior decision regarding the playground removal and the special assessment, citing the procedural violations and lack of member input. Brenda Carmichael quickly moved to table Miller's motion indefinitely, a common delaying tactic. But this time, the residents were prepared. Norris had coached them on parliamentary procedure. Several residents immediately seconded Miller's motion and called for a vote on the motion to rescind before considering the motion to table. The room erupted in calls for a vote. Finley, flustered and losing control, banged his gavel futilely. The board members looked unnerved by the unified opposition. They were forced to vote on Susan's motion. Finley and Carmichael voted against it, but under the intense pressure and scrutiny of the packed room, the other 3 board members, perhaps sensing the shifting tide or fearing a potential recall, surprisingly voted in favor of rescinding their previous decision. A stunned silence fell over the room, followed by a wave of gasps and then applause. They had won the first major battle. The playground wasn't safe yet, but its imminent destruction had been halted. The victory at the meeting was significant, but Finley and Carmichael were furious and determined to regain control. They couldn't simply reinstate the decision immediately, but they could employ other tactics. Therefore, the next phase of the battle began, characterized by bureaucratic obstruction and subtle intimidation. The board suddenly became hypervigilant about enforcing minor HOA rules, issuing violation notices to known playground supporters for trivial matters like trash cans left out an hour too long or temporary basketball hoops. They delayed approving routine requests from playground advocates. They commissioned an independent safety assessment of the playground, clearly hoping for a negative report that would justify its removal on safety grounds. The assessment, conducted by a reputable company, found the playground generally safe, requiring only minor, inexpensive repairs like replacing worn swing chains and adding fresh mulch, further undermining the board's original claims. Finley also pushed for a hefty increase in the general HOA budget for legal contingencies, widely seen as building a war chest to fight playground supporters if necessary. The Friends of Adventure Playground, guided by Norris's strategic thinking, refused to be drawn into petty squabbles or be intimidated. They meticulously documented the targeted enforcement actions, building a case for harassment. They organized volunteers to quickly fix the minor safety issues identified in the report, demonstrating proactive community stewardship. They challenged the budget increase, demanding transparency on the supposed legal threats. Norris emphasized maintaining the moral high ground, focusing relentlessly on the core issue, preserving the playground and ensuring democratic governance within the HOA. He also knew they needed a more permanent solution than simply blocking Finley's initiatives. They needed to change the balance of power on the board itself. Therefore, the group began planning for the next HOA board election, several months away. They needed credible candidates willing to run against Finley and Carmichael's faction, candidates committed to transparency and representing the broader community interests, not just pet projects. Finding volunteers willing to endure the often thankless, time-consuming, and potentially conflict-ridden role of an HOA board member was difficult. But inspired by the success of their collective action and Norris's quiet encouragement, several qualified residents stepped forward, Mark Chin, bringing his calm demeanor and connection to young families. Susan Miller, with her sharp legal mind and commitment to procedural fairness, and Sarah Jensen, whose passion for the playground and newfound advocacy skills resonated with many. Norris agreed to discreetly advise their campaign, focusing on positive messaging about community, transparency, and responsible governance, contrasting it with Finley's divisive and autocratic style. The election campaign became the new battleground. Finley and Carmichael, sensing a genuine threat to their power, fought dirty. They circulated anonymous flyers filled with distortions and personal attacks against Mark, Susan, and Sarah, questioning their qualifications and motives. They used the HOA's official newsletter, funded by homeowner dues, for thinly veiled endorsements of themselves, highlighting the progress made under their leadership, implicitly including the still hope for tennis courts. They tried to disqualify opposing candidates on technicalities related to nomination paperwork. But the Friends of Adventure Playground were prepared. They countered the anonymous attacks with positive, fact-based messaging, highlighting their candidates' commitment to the entire community. They leveraged their established communication network, the website, social media, door-to-door conversations, to ensure residents understood the stakes, the future of the playground, the fairness of special assessments, and the very nature of their community governance. Norris played a crucial role in fundraising for the Challenger slate's modest campaign expenses, yard signs, printing costs, ensuring they weren't outspent by Finley, who seemed to have ample resources. He also helped organize voter registration drives within Oak Ridge, ensuring every eligible resident could participate, knowing that higher turnout typically favored change. The key battleground became collecting proxies, the authorization forms allowing residents who couldn't attend the election meeting in person to designate someone else to vote on their behalf. Finley's faction actively sought proxies, often using misleading information. Norris coordinated a massive, organized effort by the playground supporters to go door to door, explaining the proxy process clearly, collecting forms from residents who supported their slate, ensuring every potential vote was secured. They emphasized the importance of every single vote in what was expected to be a close election. The weeks leading up to the election meeting were tense, filled with campaigning, rumor-mongering, and strategic maneuvering. Norris remained a calming influence, advising the candidates to stay focused, positive, and transparent, trusting that the majority of residents, when presented with the facts, would make the right choice for the community's future. He reminded them that this fight was bigger than just a playground, it was about reclaiming their community from autocratic rule. The night of the HOA annual meeting and election was thick with anticipation. Once again, the community center was packed, possibly even more crowded than the previous pivotal meeting. An independent election monitor, requested by Susan Miller and grudgingly approved by the board to ensure fairness, stood ready to oversee the voting and ballot counting. Both factions had volunteers checking residents in, verifying eligibility, and collecting last-minute proxies. Finley opened the meeting, his usual bluster slightly muted by the tense atmosphere. After dispensing with routine business, the election speeches began. Finley and Carmichael spoke first, defending their record, emphasizing fiscal responsibility, ignoring the controversial special assessment, and vaguely promising continued improvements to community value. Then Mark, Susan, and Sarah spoke. They didn't attack Finley personally, but focused on their platform, saving Adventure Playground, implementing transparent financial practices, ensuring all residents' voices were heard, fostering inclusivity, and prioritizing community well-being over exclusive amenities. Their speeches were heartfelt, grounded in their experiences as residents, and clearly resonated with the majority of the attendees. Then came the voting. Residents who were present cast paper ballots. Those voting by proxy had their designated proxy holder cast the ballot for them. The process was orderly but slow, each ballot scrutinized by observers from both sides and the independent monitor. Norris stood near the back, watching impassively, his presence a quiet anchor for the challenger slate and their supporters. After what felt like an eternity, the election monitor